You want me to?
Where should I sit? Just any place? Okay, that's fine. Okay, welcome to the plenary session of the conference. We want to get started. Our first speaker, David Blight, has the flu and is unable to attend. But we do have Amy Drew Stanley of the University of Chicago, who very modestly has asked me not to mention her many publications and honors. We also have Stephen Hahn, who's not here, but he would be speaking on Reconstruction as Transnational Experience, but Manisha Sinha is going to be reading his paper. And finally, we have Charles Postel, Professor of History at San Francisco State University, who's the author of the Bancroft Prize-winning book, The Populist Vision, as well as the forthcoming book, Equality, An American Dilemma, 1896 from FSG, coming out this August. So our first speaker is Amy Drew Stanley.
Welcome. Thank you to all at UConn who labored to make this possible, especially Manisha. And this paper is dedicated to my advisor, David Bryan Davis. Let me begin with a perplexity of the present, and then turn back to the era of Reconstruction to discover its roots. To anticipate the argument, there are different paths of exodus out of slavery, and not all of them are equal. So here's the perplexity, and that is the constitutional basis of a Hate Crimes Act passed by Congress in 2009. The Shepard-Byrd Hate Crimes Act safeguards the right of all persons to freedom from violence based on bias. It bars violent acts motivated by hate due to gender, sexual orientation, or gender identity, as well as due to race, color, religion, national identity, or disability. Notably, this is what's really important, the act reaches into the private sphere. That is, the sphere that does not involve state action. In Congress, justifications for the act drew on ideals of human rights. The act, it was said, would uphold the UN Charter in protecting the, quote, dignity of the human person. It would also guarantee, quote, inalienable rights framed in the Declaration of Independence, end quote. But what is peculiar is the constitutional basis of this act, where Congress derived its power to trespass into a private sphere traditionally regulated by state law. The act rests on two different constitutional pillars. The ban on hate violence due to race, color, religion, or national origin rests on the 13th Amendment. But the ban on hate violence due to gender and sexuality rests on the Commerce Clause. Bias alone is sufficient for Congress to act against hate crimes involving race under the 13th Amendment, but bias must affect buying and selling, the flow of commodities interstate, for Congress to act against hate crimes involving sex under the Commerce Clause. So listen to the language of the statute. The preamble highlights the intersection of violence, slavery, and race that empowers Congress to use the 13th Amendment. Quote, slavery and involuntary servitude were enforced through widespread public and private violence directed at persons because of their race, color, or ancestry. Eliminating racially motivated violence is an important means of eliminating the badges, incidents, and relics of slavery and involuntary servitude. End quote. By contrast, the section on gender and sexuality highlights the intersection of the market and violence. It is very specific and detailed about the link to commerce. Consider the conditions, quote, travel of the defendant or the victim using a channel or facility of interstate or foreign commerce, defendant using a weapon that has traveled in interstate or foreign commerce. The conduct interferes with economic activity or otherwise affects interstate or foreign commerce, end quote. Under the Hate Crimes Act, therefore, where the vestiges of bondage banned by the 13th Amendment are not at issue, in theory, that is, in violence due to sex, It is the commerce nexus that empowers Congress to safeguard freedom from violence. Consider the outcome. Surely it would count as a hate crime if a black person were murdered at home by a white killer using bare hands and uttering racial epithets. But suppose a wife were slain by a husband of the same race during a rape. That would count as a hate crime only if her death was caused by an object transported in interstate commerce, or if the private violence interfered with economic activity. Why? Why this odd cleft in the law, the asymmetry, the perplexity? This, I argue, is one of the strange legacies of Reconstruction, the development of a human rights tradition that is yoked to commodity relations. Put simply, my argument is this: it is where the reach of the anti-slavery 13th Amendment ends that Congress has claimed the Commerce Clause as a charter of human rights. The flow of commerce has become a source of human rights where the 13th Amendment does not extend to the wrongs of sex and inside the home and across the threshold of marriage. Since the era of Reconstruction, neither Congress nor the courts have interpreted the badges of slavery to encompass unfreedom based on sex. Rather, for more than a century, it has been the commerce power that Congress has invoked in legislating against women's subjection, making the flow of trade a source of protection against violations of free will and invasions of the body. So let's turn back to the era of slave emancipation. The boundaries of the 13th Amendment were etched at the moment of its origin. Now, that Congress would come to bypass those limits by linking human freedom with the flow of commodities appears all the more perverse, all the more ironic, because it was an axiom of abolitionism that the essence of slavery was reducing human beings to commodities. According to the American Anti-Slavery Society, enslavement was holding a person, quote, as a piece of merchandise, end quote. That very principle echoed in Congress as sectional conflict over slavery deepened and brought the Civil War. Above all, it was the figure of the ravaged bondswoman and wealth creation through slave breeding, as I've argued elsewhere, that symbolized the evil of treating people as merchandise. But sex disappeared as Congress framed and enforced the 13th Amendment and as the courts interpreted its meaning, circumscribing the sweep of the 13th Amendment. In Congress, debate over the amendment's phrasing expressed the limits of the transformation envisioned, making explicit the reconciliation of slave emancipation with sexed subjection. So, for a moment, in 1864, there emerged the possibility that the amendment might echo the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. As Charles Sumner proposed, quote, "Let us prepare for a moment to France." And he offered a text declaring, as you've heard now for the third time, quote, "All persons are equal before the law, so that no person can hold another as slave." And this language not only harked back to the French Declaration, but it also presages the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But the Senate refused the language. But not only because of its foreign pedigree, but because of the consequences for relations of men and women. The objection was that, and I quote, and the statement is by Jacob Howard, an anti-slavery Republican who was an author of the 13th and 14th Amendment, and this is what Howard said, quote, "A woman would be equal to a man. A woman would be as free as a man. A wife would be equal to her husband and as free as her husband before the law," end quote. Horrors. Well, he didn't say horrors, I said horrors. So the problem with the imported French rhetoric was that it not only at chattel bondage, but it also threatened to strike at unfreedom within the private sphere of the household. It was explicit in what Howard said. By contrast, a virtue of the free soil phrasing of the 13th Amendment, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States, was that emancipation would leave untouched relations of sex. After the Civil War, the authors of Reconstruction reinforced the limits of the 13th Amendment. Narrowly, they defined the badges of slavery to forbid wrongs of labor, contract, property, and race, but not of sex. Pursuant to the 13th Amendment, Congress enacted a series of anti-slavery statutes: the Anti-Peonage Act, Anti-Kidnapping Act, the Ku Klux Klan Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 1875, but none struck at sex-based badges of slavery. At the moment of abolition, then, Congress began narrowing what counted as slavery, right? Slavery was a big, expansive thing, just like freedom, but they're narrowing it and excluding sex. And how the Supreme Court further limited the reach of the anti-slavery amendments is well established, how the slaughterhouse cases of 1873 restricted the meaning of both involuntary servitude and citizenship rights, how in the civil rights cases of 1883, the court rejected both the 13th and 14th Amendments as sources of congressional power to outlaw Jim Crow. But it was the companion case to the slaughterhouse cases that made flagrant the anomalies of gender. In Bradwell v. the State in 1873, where the deprivation of the right to pursue employment involved a white wife instead of white butchers, as in slaughterhouse, in the Bradwell case, the badges of slavery never arose at all. Bradwell marks the conspicuous absence in 13th Amendment doctrine of matters of sex difference. Now, far less famous is a rape case that came before the Massachusetts Supreme Court in 1870. Yet this case stands as an exemplar of the doctrine that shielded the household and private violence animated by sex from the reach of the 13th Amendment. This case spoke of a bond of master and subject totally unaltered by abolition. Here is how the Massachusetts court bluntly set forth the definition of rape prevailing across the country in the era of slave emancipation. Quote, "The simple question is, was the woman willing or unwilling?" Unquote. And deciding if sex was at will depended first on whether the violated woman was a wife. The rule and the exception for marriage was that, quote, "A man who has carnal intercourse with a woman, not his wife, without her consent, is guilty of rape," end quote. By definition, then, unfree sex could not exist within marriage as a bond founded on contract and consent. The intercourse between husband and wife represented the antithesis of slavery, for the illusion of perpetual consent turned sexual violence into a legitimate taking. In the eyes of the law, it was an impossibility for a wife to be ravished by her own husband, just as a slave master was never guilty of raping his chattel. The essential difference, though, was that wives were assumed always to be willing, but slaves to have no will of their own. In the era of slave emancipation, therefore, wrongs of sex fell beyond the reach of the 13th Amendment, and Congress claimed no power to govern home life but for enforcing the dissolution of the bonds of slavery. I can do no more than point briefly at two later landmarks in this story and amplify during the discussion. Both involved acts of Congress that fulfilled international agreements. Consider the White Slave Trafficking Act of 1910, also known as the Mann Act. Irony, let's call it the White Slave Trafficking Act as its formal title, irony abounds in its very title. For the act, the White Slave Trafficking Act, was not premised on the 13th Amendment. Instead, Congress invoked the Commerce Clause to ban the transport of women across national and state borders for the purposes of prostitution. The act greatly expanded the commerce power beyond applying to objects such as steamboats, railroads, and livestock to reach illegitimate human intercourse. It complied with the 1904 Treaty of European Nations providing for global repression of the traffic. The 13th Amendment never figured in the making of the White Slavery Act. Oratory in Congress deplored making, quote, merchandise of a human soul, and called for liberating, quote, women who are held as chattel, end quote. But the project of abolishing sex trafficking produced no resolves to summon the anti-slavery amendment rather than the commerce power as a source of constitutional authority. To the contrary, defenders of the statute, countering critics who denied that women were equivalent to inanimate merchandise, put it simply, quote, intercourse is commerce, end quote. Thus, the anti-slavery impulse found new purchase in the commerce power. For all the outcry against the bondage of involuntary prostitutes, Congress did not contemplate banning the traffic in women as a badge of slavery. The White Slave Traffic Act marked the emergence of an American humanitarianism that linked the protection of persons to the flow of commerce, associating human freedom with market exchange. At the end of the century, Congress again invoked the Commerce Clause in enacting the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. The act also fulfilled an international mandate, the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, adopted by the UN in 1993. The UN instrument speaks of, quote, human rights and fundamental freedoms of women, unquote. But the US Act tethered freedom from violence to the unfettered flow of commerce. The Violence Act, the US Act, created a new private right of action, a civil rights remedy for victims of violence fueled by gender animus. This was revolutionary, meaning that even a wife could sue her husband for rape. The act annulled age-old exceptions for sexual violence in marriage that were still standing in the mid-90s in most states. Thus, an expansive commerce power became an instrument of liberation which pierced to unfree sex at home. The act reached into a private sphere of sexual exchange left untouched by the 13th Amendment. Via the Commerce Clause, Congress broke down the wall shielding the ostensibly effective bonds of the household from the rights claims of sovereign individuals. Explicitly, the act recognized freedom from brutality based on sex as a fundamental right of personhood, but it presupposed that private acts of violent sexual intercourse, even a rape committed within a marriage bedroom, had an aggregate effect on interstate commerce. At congressional hearings, the market reasoning was summed up in a single phrase, quote, sexual violence takes a toll on interstate commerce, end quote. No debate arose on the ethics of attaching the rights of persons to the traffic in commodities. Only for a moment was there consideration of the 13th Amendment as a basis for the act, on the theory that sexual violence was, quote, analogous, end quote, to slavery as a, quote, crude form of physical subordination, unquote. But the anti-slavery approach got nowhere, for it appeared too subversive of settled doctrine in, quote, generalizing slavery to the situation of women. Instead, the Anti-Violence Act affirmed the connection between human intercourse and interstate commerce. Again and again and again, it was said in Congress that the suffering of women burdened the economy, that rape and domestic violence imposed, quote, enormous economic costs, end quote. Today, the civil rights remedy is no longer part of the Violence Against Women Act. In U.S. v. Morrison, decided in 2000, the Supreme Court reined in the commerce power. The court struck down the civil rights remedy. The court spoke categorically, saying that violence against women was not, quote, economic in nature, end quote, and thus fell outside the commerce power. According to the court, and this is Rehnquist, the causal chain between sexual violence and the toll on interstate commerce was just too indirect. All right, this brings us back to the Hate Crimes Act of 2009 and its two pillars. The ruling in Morrison came down from the court during the very long debate in Congress over the Hate Crimes Act. And the Morrison ruling signaled that a ban on hate violence extending to sex and home life would likely be a dead letter. Therefore, the hate crimes bill was rewritten, and the commerce nexus spelled out ever more distinctly in the section on hate crimes based on sex. Congress shored up its commerce power by requiring direct circumstantial proof that the violence against women was both economic in nature and crossed state lines, rather than relying on this vague notion of an aggregate effect on commerce. Therefore, the dualism of the Hate Crimes Act grew more explicit, the pairing of the commerce-saturated section on sex with the anti-slavery infused section on race. Explaining how the measure had been altered to assure its constitutionality, its authors spoke of, quote, sadistic murders that possessed a, quote, commerce nexus, end quote. So far, the courts have upheld the act under both the 13th Amendment and the Commerce Clause, but no case has yet reached the Supreme Court. So, the story of a commerce-laden human rights tradition, then, is a story of the limits of anti-slavery constitutionalism. In 13th Amendment doctrine, sect subjection has never represented a badge of slavery, precisely because the 13th Amendment has stopped short at the threshold of sex. It is via the commerce power that Congress has acclaimed the authority of the nation state to vindicate sex-based human rights. A strange legacy of slave emancipation, then, is the creation of a human rights order that rests on an emancipatory law of commerce. As a consequence, sex has been potent in rendering human rights a commodity fiction. So that is the Exodus lesson for today on Passover.
So as most of you have gathered, I'm not Stephen Hahn, but I'm here to read his paper, and I actually want to thank Steve. He had to go away today for a family event, and he attended most of the conference and left his paper with me. So that was very, very good of him. So this is Stephen Hahn, not me. I'm just reading this, and he's monitoring whether I'm reading it accurately. So I will be very good and read it word for word. Okay. Christopher Hager's here? Word for word, yeah. What is Reconstruction? The question seems an odd one at a conference like this. Yet, if we are to consider the United States' experience of Reconstruction in an international and comparative context, there is a good deal of sense to it. We need, that is, to know what to put Reconstruction in relation to. Our recent attention to the, quote, greater Reconstruction has surely pushed at the geographical and conceptual boundaries of Reconstruction scholarship. But it is important to recall that there have been efforts to widen the parameters still further. For the most part, the international and comparative perspectives on Reconstruction have focused on the emancipation process and the immediate post-emancipation worlds that it consequently created. This is not surprising. Reconstruction took place in the midst of an emancipationist century, and I don't think anyone doubts that the mass emancipation of enslaved people in the United States was the episode around which Reconstruction turned, around which the possibilities and limits of the Reconstruction projects presented themselves. In many respects, the comparative emancipations literature, which was especially robust from the late 1940s through the late 1980s, was a comparative Reconstruction literature as well. Although some of this work was devoted chiefly to the questions surrounding slavery, emancipation, and race, Think of Frank Tannenbaum, David Davis, Carl Degler, C. Van Woodward, George Fredrickson. Much of it explored changing social relations on the ground, the similarities and differences between enslaved and free labor or between different coercive labor regimes, and the role of the state in enacting emancipation and supervising the emancipation process. Most of the attention turned to the British, French, and Spanish Caribbean, though Brazil, with its resident planter class and complex road to abolition, figured as well. Some of the most important contributions, like Tom Holt's Problem of Freedom, focused on one interconnected set of processes, in Britain and Jamaica in his case, but clearly had a much larger audience of emancipation and post-emancipation specialists in mind, and thereby took up a series of important questions, from the struggle over the meaning of freedom to the making of a new post-emancipation working class. Eric Foner's Nothing But Freedom, which is sometimes forgotten, not in this conference though, owing to the large intellectual space his Reconstruction volume occupies in the historiography, not only put emancipation in the southern United States in comparative perspective, but also explored how, quote, free labor evolved, not only from slavery, but also from the destruction of peasantries with strong claims to productive resources, using the example of South Africa to develop the arguments. We do need to recognize that the emancipationist century embraced more than the Western Hemisphere. Between the late 18th century and the late 19th, serfdom and other forms of peasant civility were abolished in Eastern Europe and Russia, as well as in France. And in most cases, quote, emancipated peasants shouldered heavy burdens of obligations and indemnifications for years thereafter, rewarding lords and bourgeois landowners who could then modernize their estates. The enormous demographic movements of the 19th century, which would involve such a large portion of the population of Europe, were clearly produced by the severing of peasant ties to lands and to lords that had hedged their worlds for centuries, and to the wider commercialization of agriculture there and in South and Southeast Asia. But in many cases, peasant emancipations in continental Europe formed part of a larger process of state building, when military and social crisis led evolving nation-states to exert their own sovereign powers over lands and people, not least to find bodies for their armies, laying the basis for unifications that occurred later in the 19th century. There is, in fact, a good deal to learn from the experiences of Germany and Italy during the 19th century, since their national unifications were tied up with struggles between landed classes in the East and South and aspiring industrialists in the West and the North, not to mention from Brazil, where the completion of emancipation in 1888 was followed almost immediately by the establishment of a republic in which a powerful section of the planter class formed a modernizing alliance with urban and industrial groups, and was well aware of what had been going on in the United States. There is as well much to be learned from the experiences of Canada, and especially from Mexico during this period, when efforts at state centralization and economic modernization were pursued. In the latter case, the Diaz regime, which came to power as Reconstruction ended, with convulsive results a few decades out. The international context reminds us that Reconstruction was indeed driven by the very processes to be found across much of the Euro-Atlantic world in the 19th century: emancipation, political unification, and nation building, that turned, in the US case, a union with multiple forms of sovereignty into a nation state with new powers and ambitions, new class coalitions and political economies, new forms of belonging and designations of rights, and new expectations for members, whether states or individuals. Nothing brings this home better than our notion of the greater Reconstruction, which looks out to the trans-Mississippi West. Here, the federal government took the opportunities of war and Reconstruction-related empowerments to build a transcontinental railroad, territorialize much of the landmass, suppress native sovereignties that the treaty process had half-heartedly embodied, and promote the economic development of the vast region through breathtaking incentives offered to private interests as well as through the work of the United States Army, both in defeating native resistance and in supplying labor. Which is to say that Reconstruction was not only integral to American nation building, it was also central to American capitalist development. Now, the recent literature on slavery and capitalism links the two together in close and mutually constitutive embrace, and certainly suggests that American capitalism, and perhaps Euro-Atlantic capitalism, established a firm footing well before anything we call Reconstruction took place. Yet virtually none of this literature takes up the meaning of slavery's demise or the social and economic relations that replaced it. How, that is, are we to understand the transition in terms of political economy? Nor does it generally involve the role of the state at any level. We learn instead of various instruments of exploitation, exchange, value, and finance, but very little that might help us recognize capitalism as a self-reproducing and expanding system, recognize what a political economy of capitalism looks like in relation to its many components, domestically and internationally. As best as I can see, as best as Stephen Hahn can see, the conceptual framework of slavery and capitalism scholarship is mainly neoclassical, not unlike the econometric treatments of both slavery and the transition to free labor that emerged in the 1960s and the 1970s. The language of class has gotten lost in recent Reconstruction historiography, but the struggles that composed Reconstruction empowered some classes at the expense of others, drove the big landowners in the South from effectual national power for over half a century, led to the expansion of an organized and increasingly combative working class, itself a product of emancipations and nation-building overseas, sparked bitter class conflicts in rural and urban areas alike, and gave rise to new forms of consciousness among a variety of emerging classes. Indeed, the character and limits of the Reconstruction we've been exploring laid the foundation of a second Reconstruction, not the civil rights movement of the 20th century, but the reconfigurations of state and public power during what we usually call the progressive era. And here again, we have a wide international context in which the American Reconstruction experience may be set. Internationally, too, we may reflect on a clause of the 13th Amendment that we tend to overlook, quote, or any place subject to their jurisdiction, unquote. The 13th Amendment is customarily viewed in the domestic context of the United States. But the clause reminds us both of the imperial ambitions that preceded Reconstruction and of the new imperial ambitions that Reconstruction may have advanced. Like the British example of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, American abolitionism gave political prestige to an emerging class of bourgeois manufacturers and property owners, and also wrapped empire even more fully in the garb of moral superiority and civilizationism. As you all can see, this is Stephen Hahn, not me. American emancipation and Reconstruction helped define a national citizenship that had not previously existed and chipped away at political exclusions that had left African American men on the margins of, if not utterly excluded from, civic and political life. But emancipation and Reconstruction also inscribed the measures of belonging that a national state and a nationalism required. Measures involving forms of labor and community, forms of family and sexuality, forms of religion and spirituality, all of which fueled offenses against the Chinese, Native peoples, Catholics, and immigrants more generally, who could be viewed as subverting the abolitionized order, while providing a contrived moral ballast for imperial adventures overseas. Lastly, the state-building projects of emerging 19th century nations, among which American Reconstruction took its place, not only sought to deploy new forms of power over the territorial and cultural landscapes, but also provoked mass mobilizations and various forms of resistance that either sought to defeat the ambitions of the state or to use the levers of the state for different ends. The bitter struggles of Native peoples to defend their ways of life, the rise of anti-monopoly movements across much of the country, the politicization of a freed Southern Black working class, and the eruption of populism, all of which had counterparts in Europe and European colonies, cannot be understood apart from the social dynamics and legacies of Reconstruction. In this sense, Reconstruction may be seen as a revolutionary reorganization of power that unleashed forces that had not been imagined and proved difficult to contain.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anisha. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you for getting me here. You did such a nice job reading that. Would you like to read my paper?
Believe it or not, that was the first time I read it. I was being very careful.
Well, you would do a better job, but I will struggle on. Okay. The Civil War, which was fought over racial slavery, unleashed a torrent of claims to equal rights. Former slaves and women rights activists, miners and domestic servants, farmers and factory hands pressed their demands. And equality demanded solidarity, as millions of men and women joined voluntary associations. And if we were holding this conference on democracy after the Civil War 50 years ago, these associations would be in the center of what we'd be talking about. Charles and Mary Beard wrote of the mania for fraternity among ordinary citizens somewhat later, and Farrar Scott explained that these associations were, quote, at the very heart of American social and political development. Then back in 1953, the political scientist Grant McConnell put the Farmers' Grange, the anti-monopolist Farmers' Grange, and its demands for equality and freedom at the center of his story of American democracy after the Civil War. Equality and solidarity, however, were fractured and contradictory. Divergent notions of equality clashed with one another. Fraternity and solidarity often rested on division and exclusion. And this fact gets to the heart of an inescapable dilemma, and that is that mighty farmer, labor, and women's rights movements undertaken in the name of equality were accompanied by the destruction of equal rights for African Americans and other racial minorities. The post-war decades that witnessed Herculean efforts to overcome the inequities of corporate capitalism and the sexual inequality of the late Victorian order also witnessed Indian dispossession, Chinese exclusion, Jim Crow, and lynch law. This is the paradox at the heart of my studies in recent years, and my new book is about this. It has a lot to do with our present political predicament, which is also on my mind. The starting point of all this is really the Grange. The Grange is the mother and the father of the social movements of the post-Civil War decades. And the Grange played a decisive role in the political opposition and toppling of radical Reconstruction. I want to describe how this works. The Grange was originally conceived in parallel with Andrew Johnson's policy of Reconstruction. Yes, the same Andrew Johnson who Professor Foner told us last night was perhaps the worst president ever. Oliver Kelly, a Minnesota farmer, land speculator, and journalist, spent the war in Washington working for the Department of Agriculture, which was then a very small office. In 1866, President Johnson sent Kelly on a tour of the South. And during that tour, he came up with a plan for the National Organization of Farmers to mend the sectional divide and restore the equal rights of the Southern planter. The Grange was founded a year later in a federal office in Washington by 6 federal employees and a former Wall Street investor, all dedicated to Kelly's, and for that matter, Johnson's program of national reconciliation. The Grange was structured on egalitarian principles. It believed in equality for the farming class in economic affairs and becomes a major force in anti-monopoly politics. It believed in equality between farmers. And they took this to mean including sexual equality between men and women. And importantly, it focused on sectional equality between North and South, East and West. By the early 1870s, the Grange was a colossus. In farming districts from Nebraska to Mississippi, the Grange often organized a majority of the white population. Although it was nominally non-political in many states, it was understood at the time as a great political power, and in places, even a controlling one. By 1873, at the height of its power, it articulated a vision of equality that had 2 main political targets: the monopoly of the railroads and radical Reconstruction. As Ignatius Donnelly, the leader of the Minnesota Grange, put it, the Grange's political struggle was directed at, quote, the doubly corrupt rule of monopoly and federal Reconstruction, unquote. I'm going to focus on the second half of this formula because it involves a story that is not well known. And in the name of national reconciliation and equality for the Southern planter, the Grange demanded the removal of federal troops from the former Confederacy, scrapping the Enforcement Acts and the Ku Klux Klan Act and other so-called force bills. And here's just my little piece to the discussion about reparations. The National Grange, this is Grangers in Ohio and Minnesota and California, were part of a movement to demand reparations for the Southern planters for the post-war cotton tax. The cotton tax was a punitive tax imposed at the end of the Civil War on Southern cotton, and the Grange campaigned for reparations for the Southern planter. How these politics played out varied from place to place. In 1872, Oliver Kelly recruited D. Wyatt Aiken, a South Carolina planter, to organize the Grange across the South. Aiken was best known in his home state for his role in the assassination of Benjamin Franklin Randolph, an African-American state senator and rising leader of the Republican Party. Aiken proceeded to organize the Grange across the former Confederacy. The Grange was strongest in Mississippi and South Carolina, where they were led by the planter elite, but recruited widely among white farmers. In the lower South, the Grange served as an auxiliary of the Democratic Party and a front for the Ku Klux Klan. And here it should be noted that by 1875, the murderous Aiken was the chairman of the National Grange. A year later, Aiken goes into politics, and he becomes a congressman, where he campaigns against anything that has to do with civil rights or justice for African Americans, and for scientific farming, and for the Department of Agriculture. And the Grange sustains him as their favored candidate to be the commissioner of the Department of Agriculture for the rest of the 1980s until his death. That's the lower South. Things were a little different in the upper South and the border states, where middling farmers often claimed the Grange as their own. In Tennessee, the Grange served as a bridge uniting white farmers across the divide between secessionists and unionists, between Delta planters and middling farmers in eastern Tennessee. The former President Andrew Johnson, yes, the same one, revived his political career on the back of the Grange. He was essentially a Grange candidate in the 1874 for Senate in 1874, and that's how he regained a Senate seat, through the Grange. Another person that you'll know the name of was also empowered by the Grange, Wade Hampton, back in South Carolina. One of the wealthiest planters, former Civil War general, was apparently also a Granger. In 1876, of course, he ran for governor as the candidate of redemption and white supremacy. And when the election produced a stalemate, Hampton eventually prevailed by way of shotguns and brute force. The Wade Hampton story is interesting to me. It's probably the most interesting of these. These many redeemers came to power by way of the Grange. I ran across this account in the documents of the California Grange. They held a picnic on May Day, a few weeks after Hampton came to power. 1,400 Grangers came together in a place called Colusa, California, and they celebrated the triumph of Hampton and redemption in the South as a victory for the California Grange, which I think is an interesting way to think about the nationalization of the politics of Reconstruction. One of the most significant and telling of the Grange politicos was Ignatius Donnelly. In 1862, Donnelly, who was the lieutenant governor of Minnesota at that time, he parlayed his role in the war against the Dakota Sioux. I believe you heard about that earlier in the conference, the Dakota War in Minnesota. He took part in that war. He parlayed his role in that war into a seat in the U.S. Congress. And in the first years of Reconstruction, he was a radical Republican, a fiery radical Republican. Anything short of equal injustice and equal rights for the former slaves, he declared in a speech to Congress, meant, quote, 4 million human beings consigned to the uncontrolled brutality of 7 other million human beings. The very idea is monstrous. Those aren't my words, those are Donnelly's words. The very idea is monstrous. But by 1872, Donnelly was out of office and back in Minnesota, and Oliver Kelly recruited him as a lecturer for the Grange. And Donnelly recognized the Grange's political potential. He described the Grange as, quote, a party of the people of the West, the planters of the South, and the poor men of the whole nation. And this formula appears in many Grange documents. It's an organization of the farmers of the North and the planters of the South. It's a very interesting, and it's exactly what it sounds like. That's what it is. Okay. Donnelly and many other Grangers announced that the issues of racial equality had been resolved. This is 1872, 1873. The issues of racial equality have been resolved. Quote, the old issues concerned black men. Donnelly told a gathering of Grangers. The old issues concerned black men. The new issues concerned white men. And that's the Grange politics. As the state leader of the Minnesota Grange, Donnelly formed a Grange Democratic Anti-Monopoly Alliance with the explicit purpose of defeating Republicans and the policies of federal Reconstruction. In the elections between 1873 and 1876, the Grange formed similar alliances from Pennsylvania and Ohio to Kansas and California. The Grange, in short, formed a powerful bloc in favor of sectional equality and reconciliation at the expense of black rights and racial equality. The exact impact of the Grange on President Hayes's Southern policy is hard to measure. I've tried to figure it out, but what I can say is that both in 1874 as in 1876, Hayes himself was acutely aware that there were 40,000 Ohio Grangers that potentially held his political future in their hands and who were passing resolution after resolution against federal Reconstruction. And it wasn't just the Grange. The white organizers of the National Labor Union and the white leaders of the women's suffrage movement were no less opposed to the Reconstruction experiment in racial equality. Our history books explain that Northern business leaders, intellectuals, and other elites, people like Charles Francis Adams Jr. and others, recoiled from Reconstruction and racial democracy just as they recoiled from the democratic impulse from below of the farmer, labor, and women's movements of the day. That's all real enough, but it's really half the story. The other half of the story that I'm trying to tell that I think is important, was that this same democratic impulse from below also recoiled from racial equality, and in a profound way. The Grange itself, and it did it not, this democratic impulse from below didn't follow the elites into this position. They had this position by their own autonomous purposes and own arguments and own vision. The Grange barely survived the 1870s, but it had set a pattern, a prototype for all the other great social movements that would follow. And this was especially problematic when it came to the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Knights of Labor, which are, not only were they very large in scope and power, but it's particularly important because large numbers of African Americans joined both the WCTU and the Knights of Labor for their own goals of equality and freedom, and making these organizations sites of contest over the meanings of equality in the post-Civil War decades. Now, people may be familiar, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that with the 14th Amendment, and especially the 15th Amendment, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton believed that the Republican Party had betrayed women's equality by elevating the rights of black men over those of white women. And in 1868, they endorsed the Democratic presidential ticket that ran under the slogan, "This is a white man's country, let white men rule." This is a well-known story. There's a less well-known story, which I think is also important, and that is the role of the WCTU in the election of 1884. By the mid-1880s, the WCTU leadership and much of its membership embraced not only temperance, but also an expansive vision of human equality, including sexual equality. And this was significant given that the WCTU was 10 times the size of the suffrage associations of the day. Frances Willard, the president of the WCTU, was a profoundly political person. And she wanted to build the WCTU into a national political force. And to do so, Willard and the WCTU leadership followed the Grange model of national reconciliation and building alliances with the elite women of the former Confederacy. That was her political model. And like the Grange, Willard and the WCTU leaders viewed the Republicans as the main roadblock to their vision of national reconciliation. And I haven't gone into it at some length, but there are important constituencies in the Republican Party that still believe, and it is in fact the party where campaigning for the equal rights of African Americans is taking place. But unlike the Grange, Willard hoped to gain power not by winning elections, but by putting Republicans on notice by chipping away at their votes. And Willard did that by putting the WCTU behind the Prohibition Party, or what she called the Home Protection Party. And in the 1884 elections, Willard and the Prohibition Party targeted the swing state of New York, where by a little over 1,000 ballots, the GOP lost New York and the presidency. The James Blaine campaign put the onus of his loss on the WCTU, and Willard and the WCTU proudly claimed credit for this strategy. Blaine lost and Cleveland won for a lot of reasons, but to be able to claim Republican defeats was an important part of the strategy for forging alliances with the elite women of the South. It also caused factional warfare within the WCTU, and a significant block of Republican women, including African American women, left the WCTU, or were driven out of the WCTU after the 1884 elections. And this had to do with whether, the notions of equality that they were pursuing. In 1886, the Knights of Labor plunged into municipal elections in cities across the country. It's been described as the greatest political insertion of labor in American history and insertion in American electoral politics. But this time, the Knights in the South served as an organization of the black poor, lumber workers, farm laborers, domestic servants, washerwomen, had joined the Knights to pursue their own egalitarian goals in great numbers. Yet, in the 1886 electoral campaigns in Richmond and Raleigh and elsewhere, the Knights fractured on whether or not to build biracial electoral coalitions and what the balance of those coalitions would be. And by the end of the decade, within the majority white membership of the Knights, the Grange formula of sectional equality and reconciliation ultimately prevailed. Both the Knights of Labor and the WCTU came to accommodate the hardening regime of Jim Crow segregation and lynch law. To perhaps end on a happier note, and maybe it's not, maybe it is. In the 1890s in North Carolina, a biracial group of Knights, including African American women, helped to forge a fusion agreement between mainly white populists and mainly African American Republicans. Neither party accepted the other's notion of equality. They differed deeply on what the goals they were pursuing. The interesting thing is they didn't try to reconcile their differences. They didn't try to iron it out or establish a common platform. What they did do is they agreed to fusion, and that is to not cancel out each other's votes in the face of the common enemy. And the common enemy, which was the corrupt, corporate, and white supremacist Democrats. And it worked. And in the few short years that the fusionists were in office, they did remarkable things in terms of education. I think this is another place where important things happen in terms of education for the poor, including the African American poor, in terms of voting rights, and in terms of clean government. Fusion was a successful political formula, and it was so successful that the reactionaries had no real way to deal with this except through mob violence to break their electoral power. And we all know about what happens with the Wilmington race riot of 1898 and the white supremacist campaign. That really marks the end of the politics that I'm looking at. That marks the end of, that's where my book ends. But Yeah, that's, yeah.
Okay, we have nearly a half hour for questions. If you have a question, please come up to the microphone.
I have a question for Amy. Given who I am and my field, I'm Nancy Shoemaker. I'm in Native American history. You might guess where I'm going to direct my question, but this was, of course, a very interesting distinction that you are drawing that sort of polarizes race along a track of the 13th Amendment and gender along the Commerce Clause. And I couldn't help thinking that, of course, in my field, all of U.S. Indian law is built on a scaffolding that comes out of the Commerce Clause. And I'm wondering if it wouldn't be worthwhile to triangulate these versus setting up a dualism of race versus gender. And then thinking of your title there and the idea of human rights, you know, I think the way that U.S. Indian law developed out of the Commerce Clause was actually to arrive at some fundamentals of tribal sovereignty and the basis of indigenous rights, which I see as fundamentally distinct from human rights. One, human rights being often cast as individual rights, and indigenous rights often being cast as group rights. So I just thought I would throw that out there as a possible avenue as you pursue this. It isn't really sort of challenging your what you've discovered or what you are arguing, but I thought it would be useful to, for me at least, to understand what you would make of that and how you would talk about all three at once.
Thank you. I guess the first thing I'd say is I don't think I've established the dualism. I think that I see a dualism that occurred. So, I mean, I didn't make it up. It is there. Great. Well, I'm not arguing for anything. I'm saying this is what happened. I'm not arguing. I'm not arguing for it. I'm saying this is what occurred in the way the law developed. I wouldn't say I'm arguing for it. That's true. I'm arguing that the evidence shows that there is a development of the recognition of or attempt to redress women's subjection via the Commerce Clause, and an attempt to address of subjection based on race via the Anti-Slavery Amendment. That's what I'm saying. As for Native American, it's fascinating. I don't know much about it, so I need to study it, and I welcome to be educated by you and learn more about it. So I don't have anything to say that would be as worthwhile as anything you would say at this moment. So I'd love to hear more, and when this emerged, and when is the time period that it's late 19th century? So. That's fascinating, because people read this and thought about it, and you're the only person who's pointed it out. So I realized I need to look into this, and I really appreciate it. And if you have anything that you've written about it and showing this nexus, I would love to see it. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the panel. I wonder if you could be a bit more synthetic now. This is the end of the conference, a final panel, very broad papers, and so I wonder, based upon what we've learned the last 2 days, based upon your own sense, like where you think Reconstruction is heading, where the promises are, also maybe where some perils might be in the way that we're invariably always expanding notions of Reconstruction. So I'd be curious to hear from each of the panelists.
That would be an interesting question. Is it Manisha Sinha talking or Steve Hahn? But I wouldn't dare to talk for Steve Hahn, and I'm sure he might have a different perspective on this. So let me just share what I thought of when I put this conference together on the greater Reconstruction. I saw this, of course, emerging from Western and Native American history that was giving us new ways of conceptualizing this period than had been standard. And I liked that. I liked the idea because, as has been pointed out by many of the panelists, the demise of Reconstruction cannot be neatly put at 1877. This contestation continues at many levels, and it's a protracted process. Some people might want to go down to the 1880s. I would say go right down to the 1890s, the Mississippi Way, et cetera. And, the formal institution of Jim Crow, disfranchisement, all that. There's a new regime, a new legal and political regime in the South, which is nationally accepted and then has national repercussions when it comes to the kinds of questions that Steve raised in his paper on looking at this transnationally, the questions of imperialism and state building and state formation. So all this I was very sympathetic to, but I also had some reservations about exactly what you were talking about collapsing that moment of Reconstruction that we have traditionally understood and see the Western story as simply part of the Southern story, as simply a part of this ongoing process of national consolidation and the development of the federal government and its powers, because I think they are distinct stories. And so while I've appreciated all this material that has come out from the work of Elliott West, really, and then picked up by a lot of historians of the Civil War and Reconstruction who are looking at the West and looking at the subjugation of Plains Indians, I think we can use the concept without losing what Reconstruction meant in terms of the ways that we have talked about, which is, in fact, a new legal and constitutional order, a new military, a new way of, so expanding in revolutionary ways the powers of government to enforce rights. All those ideas that are very exciting that have come up, I think we need to look at that too, without completely subsuming it in a narrative of which really buys into, I think, the whole Southern narrative of Reconstruction and big government and the oppression of, the federal government, et cetera. So that's just my take, and people may completely disagree with me, but I'm wrestling with this as I'm writing this book. So, yeah.
As someone who lives in the West, I've heard a lot about the greater Reconstruction that involves the West. And I'm very sympathetic to looking at the 1860s and 70s as a really important times for developments in the West. Of course it is. Of course these are important times. The railroads and the Indian Wars, all profound. The question of integration of the Chinese into what's going to happen there. I agree. I have the same reservations that Manisha has about the use of this term in that way. One of the reasons why I have it is because it's so anachronistic. People in the 1860s and 70s and 80s knew exactly what the era of Reconstruction was and what it involved. It involved the equal rights of African Americans. That's what Reconstruction was about. No one in the 1860s or 70s or 80s had any question that that's what the term meant. Now, sometimes they would use it rhetorically. They would use the word Reconstruction rhetorically. We have to reconstruct the country not on the basis of race, but on basis of rails, they would say. That would be a call for building railroads. But everyone knows rhetorically what they're building on. And so I find it, why would we go away from that understanding? I don't understand the value, and I think it has potential hazards, the ones that Benicio points out. Oh, this really is just the state, the great Leviathan imposing its will on the world. Unless we're going to remove the core issue of the status of the former slaves from the problem of Reconstruction, why don't we call it something else? Like this is the era of state building or something else. But I am reluctant. I am one of those people who, at first I said, oh, I'm going to use this term because I like, for my Grangers, Indian dispossession is fundamental, right? The Grange, the ground zero of the Grange is Washington, D.C., where it's conceived and formed among federal bureaucrats. But once it takes life in rural America, it's Minnesota. And the war against the Dakota Sioux is central to their imagination and dispossession and all that. But when they talked about Reconstruction, they talked about, in Minnesota, they talked about, we don't want the federal government protecting the rights of black people. That's what it meant. And the same in California, that's what it meant. So why are we reinventing it? Now, I'm open to being, and these terms of periodization, I've never had a lot of stake in them, and I don't put a lot of weight in them, and if people want to use greater Reconstruction, fine. But I think there is something important that could be lost, and not recognizing that the people of those generations knew exactly what this was about. And I think as a historical problem, we should respect that.
Quickly add one other thing. The person who has used it a lot, of course, is Richard White, right? But the book is really more about the Gilded Age than it is about Reconstruction. And ironically, much more about what he calls laissez-faire liberalism and contract freedom. And you think about laissez-faire liberalism and you look at what the state is doing during Reconstruction, it makes absolutely no sense.
Well, a while ago, a long time ago, I misspoke and used the word slave emancipation instead of Reconstruction, and Daniel Rogers corrected me, and he said, no, they're two different things, slave emancipation, Reconstruction, so I had to figure out that they were different. But I guess I would say that as I think about it, Reconstruction is all about slave emancipation, and it is about overturning a regime of property in the person, which extends not only all sorts of relations of property relations, dominion and dependency, and that in turn, that revolutionary transformation depends on the transformation of the nation state. So where I would disagree with Charles is that you can't have equal rights without that there's a fundamental remaking revolution of the nation and the terms of sovereignty and the consolidation of federal power, and it unleashed all sorts of new uses of the Constitution. So I think those two things absolutely go hand in hand. I have no stake in the greater or the lesser Reconstruction, but for me, that revolution, to me the question is the way in which it is revolutionary and the juncture of eliminating slavery, and that necessitated a remaking of law, government, and sovereignty, the whole terms of power.
Really obvious, but what part of the title of this conference related to democracy? And it seems to me that what we've had this afternoon, particularly in this session, is a reminder about the scope and severe limitations of the notion of democracy as it was reshaped in the late 19th century. That the Grange and other organizations claiming and actually succeeding in lodging democratic claims against a federal government and against their own state governments in some cases, nevertheless had a profoundly constricted view of who should be incorporated in that sense of the demos in ways that Charles has very specifically related in terms of the Grange and its vision, but Amy has also pointed to. And if we're going to talk about the Reconstruction and democracy, clearly it's a tragic as well as a hopeful story. So thank you. Thank you all.
I guess I would say David Montgomery's Beyond Equality is a really hard book to read, but it's still really important in speaking and answering to these questions. And I was thinking how little we did talk about democracy, but these questions that you're raising are right at the heart of that book about slavery and what it means for the implications of the state and labor. And so I would encourage people to go back and struggle through that, reading it 3 times in order to understand it, along with Woodward, C. Vann Woodward, The New South. I know Eric once said to me that Woodward was so incredibly important for his work. So the classics, I don't think we need to reject the classics.
Can I just say something about Beyond Equality? When I was an undergraduate, I read Beyond Equality. I was just thrilled with that book. It's such it just lights your imagination. Labor going beyond they don't just want racial equality, but they also want everyone. They want.
I can't believe it read your imagination. It gave me a headache until I could understand it.
Oh,
It was so hard. It was so hard to understand.
It's so gripped my imagination. But it also
I know, but
it
it's
also
hard.
lights this idea of human emancipation through the overthrow of capital. And I thought it was such a glorious book.
Right, well,
And I've been reading it and rereading it in my present work, and the problem is it never happened. It never happened. There was no such attempt was made. This was what David Montgomery wished it had happened. That's what that book is about.
This gets back to what Sven was talking about too, right? When you talk about slave emancipation, you talk again about the triumph of capitalism and on what terms is capitalism going to flourish in the aftermath of slavery. So when we think about slave emancipation, we have to think also about the development of capitalism.
But it's what I'm suggesting is that
Montgomery.
But it's what I'm suggesting is that these very same people who are supposedly the ones, championing human equality, going beyond equality to human emancipation, are saying, before the war is over, they're saying, we don't want to pay attention to those former slaves. We don't want nothing to do with that. It's labor's hour, not their hour. And the fact that Montgomery Montgomery is a great historian, but to me that's not beyond equality. That's skirting equality maybe. It's going around equality. It's maybe portraying equality. But at a deeper level, the labor movement was deeply involved in all these debates about equality. They didn't go beyond it. And mainly their main contribution to these debates was the side of, look, we have the 13th Amendment. We're done with this issue.
Maybe this is why it is such a complicated book, because I actually think, in a way, Montgomery is looking at race and class, even though he's talking about the 8-hour-a-day movement and the other labor struggles, right? So I like your
analysis. It's a class analysis of Reconstruction.
I like your phrase, human emancipation against capitalism, and this is where democracy comes in. We always think of democracy and capitalism as kind of marching together because that's the dominant Western Anglo-American narrative, but in fact they don't. And I think I kind of suggested this recently in an article in the HR for which I've gotten some flack, but I do think there's a tension there. And it's a tension that needs to be unlocked by precisely telling the story of Reconstruction and the greater Reconstruction. But I won't say any more because I'm going to give away my book.
Hi, thank you. So this is for you, Amy, and it's about what you referenced at the beginning of slave breeding. And I'm trying to figure out how, especially in a present-day context when we talk about modern-day slavery, often in terms of sexual trafficking, and I think often about the ways in which a reproductive labor system was destroyed with the eradication of people, of person and property. So I see why there's a kind of disjuncture between a commerce clause as the root for human rights, but I also am trying to figure out how to tell the story about what you referenced of slave breeding and what the system, how it was conceived and how that potentially continues on even after Rehnquist has kind of said it's no longer connected.
That's a big topic, but I'll just briefly say that so much of the anti-slavery attack was on the forcible production of slave property via slave breeding. And again, it was seen as the worst, the most horrible aspect, even more so than forcible labor, that you were producing human beings for the market. And so that notion of forcible sex and forcible reproduction was the essence of anti-slavery, essence of anti-criticism of slavery, but what I'm saying is that sexual aspect of it fell out. And it's a lot of it, I guess what I'm saying is how we think of what slavery is. And I think the abolitionists knew that slavery had a lot to do with sex. And when we were writing the 13th Amendment thereafter, in other words, the way I started out is I had to do some paper for a 13th Amendment Congress, and I said, okay, so I want to see if there's anything, 13th Amendment, is there anything about sex or gender? There's nothing, and I couldn't believe it. I looked for case law, there's absolutely nothing. I said, well, that's really weird. And I said, well, then I started to figure out there's nothing. And so then I realized that where it comes out of these protections, they come out of the Commerce Clause. And again, I'm no fan of sort of like commodity conceptions of people, right? And so, but then you think about this liberatory aspect of the bloody Commerce Clause, and so the kind of paradoxes of that. And so people ask me, and they say, normatively, they say, well, do I think it's a good thing the Commerce Clause is being closed like this, or a bad thing? And I say, well, I'm a historian. I don't have to answer that question, but it does seem troubling that we're writing legislation that because that the way in which we have to justify it is that the rights of women are justified because they attach to commerce, or of course, it takes a toll on commerce. So I don't know if I've answered your question about slave breeding, but I'm saying that what was absolutely seen as key to slavery is now being legislated against violence by the Commerce Clause because it's not within the scope of anti-slavery guarantees. And I guess I would say, Nancy, I'm particularly interested in not just all uses of the Commerce Clause, but the way in which it has become a charter of human rights, and particularly the counterpoint between the 13th and the 14th Amendment. Like Erica said to me, Amy, you need to focus more on the 14th Amendment. You're like forgetting the 14th Amendment. And what interests me about the 13th Amendment is it's only the 13th Amendment and the Commerce Clause that you don't have the state action. That's where you can get into the private sphere, the private. And so that's why I'm interested in the counterpoint of those two constitutional bases. The Commerce Clause is old. That's our original. That's our first revolution. 13th Amendment is the second revolution, and it should be revolutionary, but it isn't. I mean, there's a huge amount of 14th Amendment case law, huge. The 13th Amendment case law is tiny. I mean, yes, it's incredibly capacious. It was used during the New Deal. It was used during the, right? And again, we have to think about the horrors of the 1883 civil rights cases, which were like Dred Scott again. But the New Deal totally opened up the use of the Commerce Clause. And so the ACA, the Obamacare was under the Commerce Clause too. And then, right, it's Scalia. They've said, we can't have this capacious Commerce Clause. It's like everything, because it was the way of using federal power to do good, well, what I would call good things, like the National Labor Relations Act, or the Violence Against Women's Act, or Healthcare Act under commerce. And they said, stop, right? Stop. Let's put commerce back where it is. And so again, Roberts upholds the ACA under the taxing power, not the Commerce Clause.
I mean, could part of it be also because that is an undisputed sort of authorization of federal power, the Commerce Clause? They say. So that's the one place where even federalism can't nix it or state action, right? This is under federal, interstate commerce is federal powers. And I think that, again, going back to Steve's point about state building and nation building, I think that's one of the reasons why it is, I think, somewhat capacious in terms of thinking about interventions by the state.
You should have the last word.
Oh,
That's right. That's it.
Well, if I have to have the last word, I just want to thank everyone here because, I mean, as I've always said, it's your scholarship and your being here that has really made this conference a success. Everyone's been coming and telling me, this is great. I'm like, no, all I did was I thought of you guys being here together in the same room. And I think that's been the key to success of this conference, having brilliant people here talk about a topic that I'm highly invested in. Is just quite a pleasure. So thank you everyone for coming here, and thank you especially the conference services, Glenn with all the live streaming, which has been fantastic. Juliet Capsis has just been amazing. I want to give a big shout out to UConn Conference and Event Services.